So, hello everyone. As Gabriel introduced, my name is Luis, and this talk is called Planning for Exploration, Architectural Flexibility, pero sin perder la ternura. I'm going to talk about some strategies on how to organize a code base for exploratory research while keeping it performant and maintainable in the long run. We'll be using some examples from bioinformatics because that's the area I work on at UC Davis. And it's a field where users have a tendency to try solving problems order of magnitude larger than what you were planning as soon as something works. And so that's kind of challenging. And these are some of the ways that we found to evolve our software to develop new scientific insight. So, but first, a bit more about me. I grew up in a small town in Brazil called Tres de Mayo. It's near the border with Argentina. There's lots of cattle and soybeans there. But this city is kind of a funny story. The claim to fame is that Gisele Bündchen was born there. But it was just because the city where she actually lived was nearby and they didn't have a hospital. But there goes my chance of being the most famous person to leave my hometown. Uh, After that, for college, I moved to another town, São Carlos, this time in São Paulo state, and I studied computer engineering, but it was more software than hardware, but still a lot of engineering. And during college, I also started working at the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, first porting an image analysis program from Python to Linux, and then later extending its features. The experiment consisted in dropping an insect on the left side of that image that you see, like here, and tracking its movement to see if it would prefer going to one end of this Y-shaped form more than the other. One of the sides had air flowing, the other had pheromones, so it was a way of developing traps to capture these insects and avoid using pesticides. This was my first Python project, and it included writing extensions and JStreamer elements for image processing in C. I don't recommend that as your first Python project. It's kind of complicated. And as you can see, the UI is very much designed by an engineer, all these things to click around. And before this program, there was a student, usually another undergrad, that had to sit in front of it for more than an hour and keep drawing in a paper where the insect was walking around and time it, everything, and process all by hand. So this was a huge win for this poor undergrad. After college, I moved again, this time to a city between Rio and São Paulo. And I joined INPE, the Brazilian Institute for Space Research. And they had recently bought a new supercomputer and were looking for people to help scale their climate models and run simulations for weather forecasting. And this is a picture of me besides Tupã, which is the supercomputer, and Tupã is the god of thunder in Tupi mythology. I worked as a software engineer introducing version control and other good practices for software development, and learned both modern and very ancient Fortran. And Gabriel was also working with me, so if you have any Fortran questions, you can ask him. He will be pleased to answer them. So I had a brief passage in industry, but mostly I worked in developing software for other scientists to use. And so working together with domain experts to translate their knowledge into software. Open source was a great influence, and because of that, I cold mailed a professor at Michigan State University that was doing interesting bioinformatics work and was also a Python developer. And he is a Python ideas moderator to this day. And something to point out in this email that I sent is that I wasn't very sure what I was getting into with bioinformatics. But after working with image processing and climate models, I knew I wanted something that was interesting as applied computer science, something that would have users that don't necessarily are computer scientists, but increasingly had gigantic computational needs. And this speaks a bit, this is a quote from a post by John Redger that says, "It's not the case that every piece of research should be applied research, Rather, good peer research usually stems from direct personal experience with problems on the engineering side of our work. And while it's describing CS research, it's also a great strategy for solving problems in general, especially in places where there is this engineering science or maybe even engineering product loop happening. And so I applied and was approved for the PhD program at Michigan State University. And this time we need a new map. So let's move to the full American continent. And the next stop is in East Lansing in Michigan. And I joined the Michigan State University Computer Science program and also the GED lab, the lab of genomics, evolution, and development. And this was the logo at that time. It was a hard transition coming from summer in Brazil and arriving at minus 20 Celsius in Michigan, but I survived. And so I started learning more about bioinformatics. And since the sequencing of the human genome in 2001, the cost of sequencing has been dropping. And this figure always shows up to show how drastic the drop is. The white line you see is Moore's law. So if you're just depending on raw computational power to solve this sort of problems, it's not going to be enough because there's way too much data being generated. And so this also shows up in public databases. So for example, the Sequence Read Archive, which is a place that scientists need to deposit their sequencing data before publishing an article. It has over 16 petabytes of data nowadays, and it's only getting more massive. So like this estimate is from 2018. In 2020, it's actually more than 23 petabytes of data. And as the sequencing technology becomes more accessible and cheaper, the amount of data being saved to these databases is just going to keep increasing. So these are good challenges, and we need not only better algorithms, but better tools for helping scientists actually explore and understand all this biology. And that's another important distinction, that sequencing is not the only, it's only one of the methods available for generating data, but bioinformatics is as extensive as biology itself. Coming from a computer science background, I found biology extremely humbling. With computers, we often have one good solution or abstraction, and then we can use our new hammer to fix problems in many different areas. And biology is incredibly complicated in comparison. And biologists working in two different areas will use completely different methods, including different computational tools. So these challenges are good, but they are also terrifying because transferring data becomes a huge bottleneck. So this image on the right is the GenBank release 100. It was distributed in 4 CD-ROMs. And nowadays, just this database is more than 5 terabytes of data. So there's no CD that fits that much data anymore. And how do we find anything in this mountain of data? Is the data that we are searching trustable? There are quality controls and assurance being done to this data. And the main issue is that the current algorithms, they don't scale to these petabyte levels databases. So just throwing more computing is not enough. So what I want to enable with my research is to reduce computational resource required. So we can move analysis that requires a cluster nowadays to something that you can do on your laptop. And things that are only theoretical can actually become practical and start helping people solve problems. And this is to allow efficient search of very large databases by similarity or containment. And while building resilient services that can distribute the load of these calculations to the users. And more importantly, they won't disappear when funding for servers run out or when I graduate, like they can continue running if I go to industry, for example. So this is also a good point to discuss a bit about scientists and engineers. And engineers tend to try to find the best solution for a problem. For software, that can be something that runs faster or uses less memory, or even a good abstraction that will support solving similar problems in the future. And scientists, on the other way, they tend to be very question oriented. They will find any way to answer a question and then try to ask a better or even a completely different question. How fast or efficiently the question is answered is not really the goal, as long as it doesn't take forever to get an answer. There is, of course, lots of tension in both sides of this example that if both sides, they are not aware of what drives each other. So frequently a scientist will show up with a problem related to their question, the engineer will figure out the initial solution and proceed to find a better one for those requirements. And meanwhile, the scientist already left happy with the initial solution and later comes back with a problem that's hundreds or thousands of times larger, completely outside the requirements that the engineer was optimizing for. So in this sense, the challenge here is, the engineering challenge at least is like, how do we plan for exploration while balancing performance and new features without hurting both? And a huge disclaimer, like this is what I'm here to talk about today, but that's my experience, and hopefully you'll find some similarities and be able to use some of these solutions in your projects too. I'm not trying to sell the perfect solution that will solve all your problems, and you should be wary anytime someone promises some kind of magical solution. So to discuss these strategies, I'm going to be using a piece of software called SourMesh. And SourMesh is a tool for estimating how similar data sets are. And data sets in, in biology, what we are working for, are usually genomes of a specific organism. And, and also SourMesh includes a lot of related functionality for this working with this similarity estimation. This image here, for example, is a clustering of some bacterial genomes, but how similar they are. And this is usually something that has biological consequences. So a biologist will see this and can start thinking, okay, like this bluish, large bluish square here, this probably means that this is a strain of this specific bacteria, or and they can interpret this sort of information. Uh, because our goal is to develop a tool that scientists can use, we also have a lot of documentation and tutorials. And the development side, on the development side, we also have a truckload of tests. And this is something that will be very important later. These are some statistics for the contributions to SourMesh. And I use something called sourcecred.io to try to capture a bit more than just interactions that are code. So sourcecred will also capture like how many people post issues and comments and so on. And we can see that from here that CTB, which is Titus, which is my PhD advisor, and me, we have larger chunks of collaboration in this project, but there are more people showing up and contributing to it. And this also includes people that are outside our lab at UC Davis. So to be able to have these external contributors and manage all these things, just discussing some of the groundwork that we did to lay some foundations for this collaboration. And one thing is that we do async development. The public discussions and planning, they all happen on GitHub issues. And public here means a place where other people in your team can also read them. In our case, because our software is public, that means a public place in GitHub, but it could be like your internal bug tracker or other tools like Notion is pretty good for doing this kind of stuff also. In our case, we are trying to avoid as much as possible on having any meetings or discussions that don't happen on GitHub issues or pull requests. And if we do have like a face-to-face meeting or like a synchronous meeting, we take notes and put it back on GitHub. And the important thing here is that this leaves a lot of breadcrumbs that new contributors can go back and read, and also help ourselves 6 months in the future, because we can follow the reasoning that we had previously more clearly. we use the issues also kind of like a ideas dump, and sometimes come back to them like 2 years after they first showed up. This way we can open some space in our brains to think about other problems, while at the same time clarifying our thinking process to the other members of the team. Uh, this is pretty important as we have more people, like even in academia parlance, like a junior member of the team would be like an undergrad or a new grad student. And this is a way also for them to pick up what's happening in the development without we having to sit down and explain person by person every time. And finally, I particularly like to do to open exploratory pull requests for checking if a new idea work or even for taking notes for future improvements, but not necessarily going all the way to be merged right now. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's important for figuring out what are our actual requirements. And talking about requirements, I it's kind of complicated in science because I said before that scientists focus on questions and engineers focus on solutions. So this generates a lot of tension because the scientific requirements are rarely clear and they can change frequently. Uh, I don't think this is a special case in science. Most systems will have this sort of tension, but this makes long-term planning for your system very challenging. So the basic strategy that we adopted in Sour Mesh, it's pretty much these three things. Like we make it work, we make it correct, and then we make it fast. So because requirements are so elusive, and bioinformatics is a field, as a field has this tendency of trying to invert this order and focus on performance too soon. Which we try to follow this to try to cover our bases and figure out what we want to do before we try to do the best thing possible. So let's go step by step and see what I mean by this. So the first one, make it work, is about prototyping and exploring ideas and figuring out if it's worth to put more effort in a solution or in this basic prototype. So if the idea doesn't work like you planned it at first, or if a small subset of, or with a small subset of the data, we try to figure out a better approach and then let use more resources to make it practical for general use. Uh, you can also use test-driven development if that's your thing. We tend to alternate between TDD and like developing something first and then writing the tests later. Uh, but the main thing here is that Python is pretty amazing for doing this kind of work because it allows fast prototyping and has these incredible resources like Jupyter notebooks for documenting your rationale when you're testing these ideas. It has PyTest for checking if what you're doing is working for specific inputs, and also has the SciPy stack, which is great for summarizing your finding and what you're measuring to check if your idea is working. And it's also pretty important at this point to listen to what your users are asking for, because something that we do in our lab is to try to let the users drive where the project is going. So we try to not to, just a second, because I'm taking my cat out of the way here. We try to not dismiss user requests because because they don't understand the computational trade-offs for the tool, or if their suggestion go against our perfect architecture. But this is really hard advice to follow. And at least for me, my gut feeling always screams, no, dude, this will destroy my perfect little castle. But it's always worth digging deeper and understanding the user requests before dismissing them. And in our case, our users are biologists, and especially they are probably not specialists in my area of expertise, like they are not specialists in computer science, but they surely know more about their own problems. And working together to figure out can lead to huge rewards later. So for some examples in Sour Mesh, these are all features that are possible because we had biologists working closely with us and looking for solutions for their problems that we could actually adapt Sour Mesh to solve. But it was not something that we thought beforehand. So we started large-scale indexing of thousands of data sets. Actually, it's millions of data sets nowadays, this stuff I'm doing. We can do compositional analysis of metagenomes, which is a new method of figuring out which organisms are present in a sample. We can do decontamination of reference genomes in public databases. And contamination here is a huge problem because if people are using these reference genomes as the truth and there's contamination, their results will be actually wrong because of that. And another feature is alternative encodings for the sequence data to try to account for long evolutionary distance. So after we have something that's working, we try to make it correct. So when I say make it correct, it's not necessarily, I'm not talking about formal methods, but if you have that kind of time and resources available, more power to you. But I'm talking about some fairly simple testing. Tests, they don't strictly guarantee correctness, but they will loudly show that you're wrong when they fail. So we write tests for corner cases, for verifying the expected behavior of a function or some piece of functionality in the code. We try to use a realistic subset of the data to see if our method is actually behaving correctly with real data. And there are many testing strategies, but the important thing is that you have some sort of testing in place in your code base. And the other thing, the counterpart, is that going for full coverage is something that we usually avoid, not because we don't want full coverage, but because it tends to lead to digging into internals of the implementation. And tests that are going for full coverage are usually going to break if the internals change. So hopefully you can trigger all the conditions in your code base for full coverage, but we mostly focus on testing the public interfaces of our code base. We also try to avoid complex tests because if it's hard to follow what the test is doing, then you will probably have a hard time debugging the failing tests later. And that said about complex tests, I'm a big fan of property-based testing. And in Python, we have one of the best tools for it, which is called Hypothesis. And I highly recommend checking it if you don't know Hypothesis yet. And also we use testing, or at least I like to think of tests as a regression tracking tool, because if you found a new bug, write a test to trigger it. And this way we will not accidentally reintroduce the bug in the future because we have a test that's actually checking for that bug. If there's some unexpected behavior, go and write a test to corner it and then fix it if it's actually wrong. But if it's something that wasn't intended, maybe you will need to support it now. So having a test that triggers it is important. And testing is also essential to be able to refactor code with confidence. Again, with the caveat that tests don't prove that you're right, but they can show that you are wrong for specific conditions. Finally, the third step is make it fast. And before you try to make something fast, is that if you can't measure, you can't really be sure that you're optimizing the right thing. And in the Python case, there are great profilers, and I particularly like PySpy and for tracking CPU usage for functions, and HeapTrack for doing memory consumption tracking and what's being allocated or not. In our specific case, it's also great because both tools work with Python extensions, even extensions that are written in Rust like ours is. We also do a lot of benchmarking during continuous integration to try to track performance regressions. And we use a tool called ASV, which stands for airspeed velocity. which is pretty great for doing this sort of small tests to check if the function is not getting slower over time. And I said before that large test coverage is not like we don't want the full, but you do want large test coverage for pretty much uh, any sort of trying to make stuff fast, because you need to, or you don't need, you must keep everything working after the optimization. And if there isn't a benchmark for what you're optimizing, then probably it's a good idea to try to write a benchmark first before you start optimizing. Important thing is like don't optimize blindly. Always measure what you're optimizing. In the sour mesh case, Rust is our superpower for making stuff fast, because the core of sour mesh is implemented as a Python extension in Rust, and it used to be C++ before, but I'll discuss later why we changed. And it's exposed to Python using CFFI, which is a pretty cool library also, if you want to check. And so the way that we do make stuff fast in Python is that we do prototypes at the Python side, and then if it's not fast enough for our use cases, we move it to Rust and then expose a new function to be called from Python. So this led to huge improvements, and Rust allows tighter control on memory consumption. And the Rust compiler can also do optimizations that are pretty much impossible to do in a dynamic language like Python. Maybe you could do some of them with PyPy and or a JIT compile version of Python, but other complications there. And because of how memory is structured by Rust, it also helps to unleash parallelization and concurrency without all the shared memory problems and deadlocks that happens with other languages. And the sour mesh core nowadays, this part implemented in Rust can also be run in the browser using WebAssembly. And I have a demo in this blog post that's linked. I will put the presentation up later in the, I was Gabriel to put on the meetup page so you can follow the links. And the blog post has more details on how it works. And finally, refactoring is also pretty amazing with Rust, because with static typing and the compiler helping you, it's way easier to be sure that it's actually correct. And I can do a full talk of just about Rust, because Rust is really impressive. But one thing that I would say is that it also influenced me a lot on how I design Python programs nowadays. And I think it's a great language to learn, even if you don't end up using it. And this figure here is kind of one of my favorites. 3.0 is the sour mesh version where we transition to the Rust core. And the running time for this specific feature, the compare feature, dropped from 50 seconds to like less than a second. So we have this huge drop in running time. And we also reduced the memory consumption a bit, which is kind of nice. So hopefully the basic strategies can also be useful for you. But there are a few more that I would like to discuss that also work for us. And I said that before we had on a previous version of Sour Mesh, we used C++ for performance in the core functionality. And the bindings were written in Python, which is kind of a Python-like language that allows you to use C and C++ types to make your code faster. And this worked well for some time, but we always had a problem of getting the functionality stuck in this middle Python layer and not transitioning all the way from Python to C++. So it was kind of living in this weird limbo in the middle. And this was especially annoying when I did this first browser prototype, because I couldn't reuse more code because it was in this Python layer. If at least it was in C++, I could use mscripting or something to compile it to put in the browser. But since I would have to move a lot of functionality into C++, that's when Rust showed up as an alternative. And because since I was going to put more stuff in C++, why not use a language that actually has proper package support and would allow fixing some of the memory problems that C++ has? Uh, kind of a consequence of this transition to Rust is that it also led to the realization that having an abstraction funnel was useful. So Rust exposes the functions as a C header that's picked up by CFFI on the Python side. And while that requires being more explicit about where data lives than Siphon required, it also forced more separation between the code bases and more planning about when to copy data from one side to the other. So nowadays we avoid moving data from Rust to Python, and that creates many performance benefits. And the thing C layer in the middle, represented by the C header here, kind of also avoids trying to map high-level Rust features to high-level Python features, which in turn allow both code bases to evolve and explore each language strong points. So this also opened the way to use the core in other languages because the C foreign function interface that represented by the C header here is supported by pretty much any mainstream language. Just as a side, I don't think I will ever replace Python in this project, so no need to worry there. I can still continue presenting in Python meetups. And a consequence of this is that a very good strategy is to refactor all the time. But you can only do that if you have a lot of tests and you can have some reasonable confidence that what you're refactoring is actually correct. And one thing that we do while refactoring is that if we find issues during the refactoring, then we write more tests to be able to cover our bases. So because of how our code base ended up organizing between Python and Rust, we also have the benefit of the Python test doubling as Rust integration tests. And this separation also allows us to refactor without affecting the other side. So here are two recent examples. With the one on the left, which is pull request 1059, is a huge user experience improvement, but it's all on the Python side at the command line interface level, and it doesn't touch Rust code at all. And 1045, which is the one in the right, is a huge performance improvement, and it doesn't touch Python code at all. These kind of synergies are really useful for evolving our software because we can focus on different aspects of the program without breaking the other part. And going a bit back to this funnel abstraction, here I'm discussing Python extensions, but you can also think of this like as the C header being in your REST API, for example, or how much you're exposing of the internals of your code base to the consumers of your interface. Another strategy or a discussion here is touching the problem of choosing wrong abstractions. And our architecture is not very complex, and this is kind of by design, because we try to avoid abstracting behavior when we only have one sample to abstract. We try to do that when we start seeing too much duplication on the code base. And that's the point where we try to find commonalities and then create abstraction that will cover all these cases. And I really like this quote from Sandy Mertz, which is, duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction. But also, again, this doesn't mean that every abstraction is wrong. Is that sometimes if you have an abstraction that is wrong, it's better to roll back and duplicate some code than to keep pushing for the wrong abstraction, because that will cause more trouble in the long run. So specifically for sour mesh, I like two examples. One of them is the index abstract base class that was created when we started moving common methods for dealing with different index classes. In sour mesh, we have this thing called an LCA database and an SBT database. Uh, and so we started moving similar methods from both of these classes to this abstract base class. And then we specified many features in the code base in terms of this abstract base class instead of using specifics from each database. So this led to a lot of simplifications in the code base. And also this kind of thing start helping to actually drive the scientific research in the lab, because another example is Gather, which is our method for taxonomic profiling of the metagenomes. And we started it as a method on top of a specific data structure, but later we figure out that it applies to in larger contexts and for other data structures that support specific operations. And it actually became like an essential part of my PhD dissertation. So this is something that you can use user cases like this taxonomic profiling that actually came from a biologist in our lab to actually drive computational science research, for example. And that was kind of what I wanted to say. So open to questions, and thank you all for listening. And special thanks to Gabriel for inviting me to speak, and all the people in the Deep Lab that made Sour Mesh happen, and to my wife Stephanie, who has to put up with this sort of situation that you can see on the bottom left. And now she's laughing here because she didn't know that she was in the presentation. So, questions?
Thank you, Luis. So people, if you want questions, you can click the button raise hand on the participants, or you can also write the questions in the chat. Okay, Robert, I am unmuting you. Okay, Robert.
Hey, Luis.
Yeah.
Great talk. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the exploratory pull requests and what you typically use those for, and like what they look like in general.
So one example of an exploratory pull request was actually the Rust core change, because what I did is that I took the C++ parts, I removed them from the code base, and I put Rust in the place, and I made all the tests pass again. So this was an exploratory pull request that lasted for almost a year and a half while I was working on and off on it. But in the end, it was actually a gambit that paid hugely, because like nowadays, I actually converted my advisor. He writes C++ since like 1989, when C++ was completely different, for example. And nowadays, he's a huge Rust enthusiast, for example. But another example that I linked back in the presentation was also figuring out, for example, better tools for our development process. So one that I had linked was putting Black to run in our code base for code formatting, and also pre-commit hooks to have people run checks on their local machines before submitting changes for pull requests. So this is kind of like a request for comments also for other participants in the project to submit their comments.
Nice.
Thank you, Robert. We have another question in the chat from Beto. Beto is also our friend who worked with us with the weather forecast. Beto is asking, what's the best way of someone who knows Python to start learning Rust?
Turns out that the Rust community has pretty good open resources, like free open resources. So the Rust book is a great introduction to the language. There are there's also a Brazilian guy called Bruno Rocha who wrote. He has a GitHub page, which is, I think it's Python. It's Rust for Python users or something like that. I can link on the presentation later. I have a page for additional resources, but it's also a great way of comparing. Yes, thanks, Alexandre. It's Py2RS if you search on GitHub, and has a lot of resources on your exploration of Rust from Python.
Nice. Yeah, Beto just posted the link on the chat. He just found it. Anyone else have any question? Because I also have one. So I will go then. Okay, so I like that you started with project management because we might underestimate or not even consider talking about project management when we talk about performance. Because performance is not only the performance of the program, but also the performance of the engineers working on it. And I see like you showed that you always start a discussion with GitHub issues, and you never like decide anything that's not documented there. And I remember that like 2 weeks ago, my project manager, he asked me to look at something in one of our features and to get him what's the exact logic that's going on and why it was done like that. So the logic's this, I figured it out, but I have no idea why it's like that. Because this was done 3 years ago by someone who's not even in the company anymore. And I don't know where to look at that. Like we have Jira, we might have a dozen different sprints and backlogs, different Jiras for different teams, and we might have like 100 from teams that doesn't exist anymore. But how can I find where this was discussed? And even if I find the Jira from that team at that time, you probably don't have the product discussion there. So my question for you is, was it easy for you to get like, the people that the scientists what are the ones who create the requirements, so was it easy to get them to always document that those discussions, or did you have some resistance on that? And if you have any tips on how to do that, because I would love to have all the discussions documented, because we have discussions after we decided to do, but we don't have discussions before we decide to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. So for the first question, for getting the scientists to write, it's a bit harder because GitHub is also, it's okay for us that are software developers, but getting a scientist to sign up for GitHub and post thinking issues is kind of scary. So in these cases, we also try to work together with them, like in mentoring them on how to write or how to get out of them what they are trying to say. And this is especially important for kind of setting the standard for the other people to follow. So for example, even if we don't have an issue that discuss a specific implementation that we are going to do in a pull request, at least in the pull request, we try to explain why we are doing that and what we are changing. And because we do that, any new person, any new contributor that shows up and submits a pull request, they see that and they are, oh, okay, I need to write something like that to also explain what's happening. So it's kind of the default, the standard that caused it. But also something to keep in mind here is that our team is pretty small. So we keep switching our hats all the time. So sometimes I'm working as a software developer, but sometimes I'm QA. Sometimes I'm doing project management and moving, like going back and tagging stuff and trying to link things. And same thing for Titus, which is my advisor and the other main developer in this code base. So we also, it's not like I'm just doing performance optimization and someone else is just doing user experiment improvements. Like we keep switching all the time what we are doing. But yeah, I don't know, keeping track of everything in GitHub issues has been really great for for doing this kind of development, and also to mentor people, because of course we are academics, so like we are teaching people all the time, and a huge part of being a professor, like my advisor, is actually teaching. So if we can also find ways of mentoring people that don't demand us being present all the time, that's also a great way of going forward.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I agree that size will make a huge difference on this. It's one thing for like your lab is like 10 people, and Carta is 1,000 people. So yeah. Kendall has a question. Do you want to ask the question, Kendall?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I was wondering, like, how do you collaborate with industry? Like, do you get pull requests from them, or are there or do you use their other packages from industry, other open source packages?
Yeah, good question. So we we do have industry users. Sometimes they show up and say that they are using the software. Sometimes it's also funny because there was one time that I was releasing Sour Mesh, and usually when I release Sour Mesh, I push the source code to PyPI and then later push the wheels. And that the wheels are super useful for Rust code, because then you don't need to have the Rust compiler in your machine to compile the extension from source. And there was someone from industry that came to the issue tracker and say like, oh, I can install this version. And like it was 5 minutes after I pushed the source code, and then I say, okay, sorry for that, I'm still pushing the binary wheels, so you don't have to compile the code, so probably in 15 minutes it will be ready for installing. And that was actually the case. But this was like from a company that does carbon cycle research. So they are trying to capture carbon from the atmosphere using bacteria and microbes and things like that uh, to to deal with climate change. So that was kind of awesome. But we also had some more direct interactions with industry also, that people showing up to ask for features or to discuss specific issues that we had in the code base. And finally, there is people from the Chen Zuckerberg BioHub, which is kind of researchy, but it's also has their industry components. And they actually became collaborators in the project. Like they are maintaining parts of the code base because were using for some features, and they kind of started owning those parts of the code base because they were the largest users. So that was pretty cool.
Nice, that's awesome. It sounds like it's got a lot of users. It's pretty popular.
Yeah, bioinformatics in general is kind of complicated also, because uh, life science companies, they usually think that their special sauce is the specific pipeline that they have to process the data. So they don't tend to collaborate much. They tend to complain a lot about your software, sometimes in front of you in conferences when they don't know that you were the person that wrote the software. But oh well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so just for one last thing, for using industry packages, there are some Rust packages that we use that I also start collaborating that actually come from companies. But most of the things, the packages that we use are like on the scientific Python side, so NumPy, SciPy, Pandas, which have huge, like a lot of companies contributing to the development, but it's not necessarily developed by a specific company.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right. Any more questions? Okay. Galina asks, do you have any open positions for the QA engineer position?
Is that a question for me or for Carta?
Yeah, for Galina, please. Is that for Luis or for us? For UC Davis. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Sadly, no, because funding for scientific research is always complicated. Uh, we would really like to have more software developers participating on the software development. Having a QE engineer would be a dream, actually. But sadly, no, we don't have any open positions. But if you want to get in contact, I can keep that in mind and talk with my advisor who has the money for paying for these things.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, I think this would also be a question like how did you jump from uh, you actually we are in an academic medium like on weather research and change, but you did like a code mail, but you'd also done the industry before going to UC Davis. Uh, how does that happen usually? Is for example you're doing CS PhD, but you're not on a CS team, you're not on a CS department. Is that common, and how can someone look into this kind of transition?
Yeah, so in my specific case, like me code mailing my current advisor was was similarities on how we thought about how science should be done, on the computational aspects and software engineering, how to organize science and how the open science stuff and so on. And the I did do some like I I did some problems involving bioinformatics before, but like kind of just a hobby, not necessarily that was something that was on my mind that I was going to work with bioinformatics all the time. But as I said, like the thing that I like to do is to kind of allow other people to do great things. And so that was something that for me, like this computational area that I found where I'm actually the computer science specialist, but I can work with people from other areas. Like this is something that I really like to do. And yeah, applying for the PhD per se was kind of an adventure because I didn't even know that it was possible to apply without funding from Brazil, for example, or like if my advisor would have funding for me or how the system works. So I was kind of jumping into